Hello, I'm Sally Bushell and I'm a professor of Romantic and Victorian poetry in the Department of English at Lancaster University. And today I'm going to be talking to you about Shelley's poem Ozymandias. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and we can get going. So what I'm going to do today is think about very quickly, short and sharp, 5 ways of understanding Ozymandias as a romantic poem. I'm going to begin by reading the poem itself because I think that's really important, and also in the Romantic period you would often share poetry and other texts and read them aloud. Ozymandias. I met a traveller from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away." Okay, so what makes this poem a typical romantic poem? Well, one thing it obviously does is it participates in an interest in ruins in the period. Prior to this point, ruins have just been seen as ugly lumps of stone, but the Romantics come along and say, actually, these are places, sites that we can reflect on our own place in history and space and time. And we see books like this, The Ruins or Meditations on Ruins by Volney, very influential. And of course, Napoleon has also invaded Egypt and written up about the Library at Alexandria and various ruins and tombs of the kings. So Shelley is taking part in that revived interest in ancient ruins. He's also quite directly drawing upon those Egyptian tombs, and particularly the statue of Ramses II, which stood on the banks of the Nile, and at this point was in fragments on the ground. An inscription on that statue of Ramses was reputed to have read, "King of Kings am I, Ozymandias," and Ozymandias is the Greek name for Ramses II. "If anyone would know how great I am and where I lie, let him surpass one of my works." So we can see that Shelley is directly engaging with this interest in ancient tombs. Secondly, another way in which it's very characteristic of Romanticism, it reinvents the sonnet form. So Romanticism is a very experimental period, and the writers are kind of playing around in all kinds of new ways with all kinds of forms, epic, the ode, the lyric, and also the sonnet. The sonnet is a traditional poem of love of 14 lines, and it should take the form of either a Petrarchan sonnet with 8 lines, 6 lines split, or a Shakespearean sonnet with a 4-4-2 split. If we look at the rhyme words that Shelley uses, you can see very easily that he plays with both those forms. He sort of mixes it up, and he has like a 4-4-3-3 split, which is very unconventional, but also that he kind of runs across those breaks. So actually the first full stop in the poem is not until this exclamation mark, "Look on my works, you mighty, and despair." It's actually one very long sentence that's running right across, pulling across and away from the rhyming words. And he does that because there's this long sentence and then the very short half line underneath it, "Nothing beside remains," which counters it and obviously juxtaposes the irony of that great statement when there's nothing there. This also allows him to have kind of two endings to the poem. So we have one ending, nothing beside remains, and then the final three lines that kind of pull back. It's almost like a cinematographic effect. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. And you just have this sense of emptiness and desolation. So Shelley is being very experimental in the way he uses the sonnet form. Thirdly, Romanticism is an age of great revolution, the French Revolution, but also rebellion against sort of powers of religion, the church, authority, government. It always wants to critique authority and overreaching ambition. And again, the figure of Napoleon is very powerful there. Napoleon's this great leader, but also, who is fallen from power at this point in history. And again, we see Shelley doing that through the figure of Ozymandias as this clearly not kind and friendly leader. His frown, wrinkled lips, sneer of cold command. He's clearly a very proud and arrogant king, and that's reinforced by his great claim, look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. And clearly the whole poem is a critique of human ambition. You know, he thought he was everything. He built this massive great statue, and it's just now in the middle of nowhere. No one even knows it exists. But above all, what the poem does very characteristically is to validate the poet and the power of poetry over other forms of power and authority in the world. The poem begins, I met a traveller from an antique land, and the poet is retelling this story. The fact that it is a story is very, very untypical of the sonnet as well. So it's like a narrative, which is not what a sonnet normally does at all. And Shelley does that because what he's really doing is kind of containing Ozymandias, and we have a retold tale. The traveller is telling the poet the story, the poet is telling us that story, and within that, the words on the pedestal. So Ozymandias is kind of diminished. You know, his great claims are twice contained within the text itself. And of course, if we think back to the original inscription that supposedly Shelley is looking back to, it said, King of kings am I, Ozymandias. If anyone would know how great I am and where I lie, let him surpass one of my works. And in a sense, that's, you know, Shelley is meeting that challenge, and he's going, I can surpass it. I don't need to build a huge, great statue. I don't need to think of myself as a king of kings. I can just do that with my pen through the power of words. And now all that remains actually is this poem. So again, very characteristic of Romanticism's interest in immortality and fame through language. Finally, the poem exists in lots of different forms. And here we can see on the left a first draft, very early first draft, with Shelley's scratchings and pictures and sums, lots of crossed out words. He's working on the description of the statue and the legs in the desert there. And he's drawing on the manuscript, which he often does in early draft. Then we see a cleaned up version, still in Shelley's own hand, but much neater, fair copy, where he's copying it out to make a nice clean copy. And finally, the publication in the Examiner in 1818 in the newspaper. And again, something we can do with Romanticism, because poets realize, you know, the process matters, how I write the poem matters, and start to value their own process and their origins. And we can, as critics, compare across these and look at different versions of the text. So that's it in a nutshell. I hope you enjoyed this, and do go off and read the poem again and think about it further.